If we start with a person, an imaginary person, a fantasy person as it were, even a fantasy child, who has a whole self on the inside that is connected with their consciousness. They have a natural, spontaneous ability to fight for themselves, to know who they are, to know what they like, to know what they don't like, to know how they're feeling, to know when they're being violated, to know when they're happy, sad, to have interests, to have talent, to have natural, spontaneous creativity, natural, spontaneous expressions of their self. And then this child, this imaginary person, this person who, to some degree, is everybody that I've ever seen in the world, experiences violations, experiences sometimes crushing violations. Violations of the body, violations of the emotions, violations fundamentally of that sense of self. Their self is penetrated, attacked, criticized, shut down, broken. And what happens to that person, that self, is naturally, the first thing that happens is they rebel against it. They want to expel the violator, get rid of the invader, defend their boundaries. But what happens when those violations continue regardless? And the person learns through the most painful experience of life, through overwhelming emotion, that nothing he or she can do will stop this violation. That his or her reactions, his or her feelings, his or her protestations do nothing to stop the violation. The violation is going to continue. Often this starts right within the family system with the child's parents, where the child's parents do not accept certain sides of this person's self. In some cases, in the most extreme cases, perhaps the parents don't accept the child's whole self. What happens to the child when he or she learns that it is actually disadvantageous to have a full self, disadvantageous to have his or her full range of feelings, that it actually makes it worse to have a full self? When a person is being violated, to have a self, to have reactions, to have boundaries, actually just makes the violations worse, the attacks worse. The person learns to shut down. The person learns to distance himself from his or her feelings. This is a basic survival technique that the human organism has. Animals have it too, actually. It's a sense of learned helplessness, that it's better to be helpless, it's better to be powerless, it's better not to fight back against this trauma, because then the trauma, the attack, the violation will be lessened. And so what happens is the person splits off parts of him or herself, pushes them down, buries them into this part of the mind called the unconscious, where they can sort of be psychologically hypnotized in a permanent, long-term, ongoing way. Take memories, put them out of consciousness. Take feelings, break them, split them off, snip them off, put them away. Try to throw them away, and into the garbage pail of the unconscious they go. And this person develops a false self, a personality that fills in the gaps, fills in the vacuum.
This isn't something that's only about phone hacking. There was microphones in window boxes outside the house. There were trackers, microphones dropped into my car. There were medical records of me and mothers of my children, for instance, all blagged and stolen out of the NHS. And perhaps most spectacularly, the burglary of both my flat and my office.
Speaking to me in an ITV documentary, this is Hugh Grant's first interview since his settlement with the Sun newspaper. He made these claims in his recent legal action, allegations the newspaper has always strongly denied.
In the case of my flat burglary, yeah, it was quite spectacular in that the whole door had been taken off its hinges and nothing was stolen. They'd been there to get information, and a lot of information about the interior and the contents of my flat appeared in newspapers a couple of days later.
How do you feel today here?
He says he reluctantly settled out of court for an enormous sum of money because even if he'd won at trial, he could have faced a £10 million bill. The Sun settled without any admission of liability.
If you're innocent, why do you shove so much money at someone not to go to court?
Newsgroup newspapers told us in some disputed cases it's made commercial sense to settle before trial. The scars of unlawful tabloid tactics run deep.
From the ages of 15 to 21 essentially, I had an inescapable abuser, the press.
From the age of 16, Charlotte Church was being hacked by the News of the World.
There's just a level of paranoia and anxiety. We used to say, oh God, have they tapped our phones? Have they got microphones in our house?
Let's go.
So my mother, already an incredibly vulnerable woman, her mental health was really bad, and I'd found her after taking an overdose. She was in a really bad way, and that was straight in the press. Straight in the press. No idea again where it came from. I mean, it was horrific. And she's never been able to fully come back from the abuse that she suffered.
In 2012, the publisher of the News of the World paid substantial damages and offered its sincere apologies.
Them times were like the best times in my life, until I started getting hacked and that.
Even national heroes became victims.
And I went paranoid. So I went out and bought 6 phones. So I just kept on changing numbers. And you think, God, when's it going to stop? Yeah, and I become a recluse. Didn't want to speak to nobody.
Paul Gascoigne was unlawfully targeted by Sun tabloids as he was struggling with addiction and treated in rehab.
I was just speaking to my mum and dad, and just them. The next day it'd come out in the papers. So I went mad. I said, what the are you speaking to the papers for? I said, well, I haven't spoken to them. I said, you have. You're the only 2 I've spoken to. I love my mum and dad. So to think they thought they were hackers was good.
In 2015, Mirror Group newspapers were ordered to pay damages and apologised. A claim against the News of the World was settled with a full apology in 2012. The Sun settled later without admitting liability. Other allegations reach the very heart of power.
There seemed to be no limits to what this group would do.
Despite the publisher's strenuous denials, Gordon Brown has accused Newsgroup newspapers of unlawful information gathering since he gave evidence under oath at the Leveson inquiry.
My bank account was broken into, my building society account was broken into, my gas bill, my electricity bill, my telecommunications bill. I know that they tried to get information from the police computer about me. All these things happened to me during the period I was Chancellor and Prime Minister.
This respected statesman now joining others, calling for fresh criminal investigations.
I don't hold massive grievances against the foot soldiers or these guys who did this stuff. Not against them, but I remain bitter and determined to exact justice on the executives who commissioned this stuff.
Despite apologies and more than £1 billion spent on legal fees and payouts by 2 of Britain's biggest newspaper groups, for many, the pain endures. Rebecca Barry, ITV News.
Psychiatrist is tonight telling ITV News that the state of mental health care in the UK is shameful. Figures show just over 50,000 people were sectioned under the Mental Health Act in England last year. Black people were nearly 4 times more likely than white people to be detained under the Mental Health Act. And there's been a 53% increase in the number of children in mental health crisis since 2019. Our health correspondent Rebecca Barry was given rare access inside a secure mental health hospital. There she heard emotional pleas for more to be done to prevent patients ending up in such places.
A rare opportunity to see what goes on behind the locked doors of a psychiatric hospital.
We have over 3/4 of the patients detained here.
This is Oxley's house in South London, where people are treated when their mental health reaches crisis point.
Are you guys okay?
15 out of the 20 women on this ward have been sectioned, detained for their own safety or the protection of others.
Obviously their liberty has been taken away from them at that point, but it doesn't mean that all of their rights have been taken away from them.
But across England, mental health services are creaking, leaving thousands to descend into mental health emergencies.
Recently we've been seeing people who are more unwell when they come to the hospital. I think we see people who are kind of later in the stage of their illness, so they need more urgent help. I think there are failures in the system in general. I think we don't have the resources that we need to provide the care earlier in the pathway.
To prevent them reaching crisis points.
To prevent them from getting so unwell that there is no alternative.
The latest inspection of this hospital found patients here are treated with respect, given therapy and rehabilitation. But elsewhere, some feel more harmed than healed by the system.
This is where I'd sort of self-harmed and was by myself for hours.
How do you feel looking at that photo now?
I almost don't recognise her. She was so desperate and so sad.
Tiwa was sectioned under the Mental Health Act between the ages of 16 and 18.
And there were periods where I was like restrained for hours and like injected with sedatives multiple times a day. So then all I do throughout the day was just sleep. I came out and I felt really broken, like nightmares every single night. It was such a traumatic environment.
She started to self-harm as a teenager and feels if she'd had the right therapy sooner, she wouldn't have been sectioned.
The waiting lists in itself for therapy are so long, and your mental health doesn't pause whilst you're waiting for anything. All that's going to happen is it's going to get worse.
Do you feel let down or that you were abandoned by the system?
I do feel so incredibly let down. I remember having absolutely no hope whatsoever, and all I was trying to do was get through the next hour. Sorry, can we pause for a second, please? Sorry.
This, say many, is part of the solution, a place where young people can come for help before they reach crisis point.
I locked away all the bleach and all the knives and sharp things and all the pills because I was worried.
John's 11-year-old daughter, Isabella, came here last year.
Where do you fear Isabella might have been today if she hadn't had this service?
Well, she may well have killed herself or tried to kill herself, and that doesn't bear thinking about, really.
Set up by the charity Mind, this centre is paid for by the NHS, but beyond next month, funding is uncertain. Dr. Laddie Smith is president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists.
We have services that are so overstretched because there's enormous demand, but they've been chronically under-resourced.
She says deprivation and discrimination increase the risk of someone developing a mental health problem.
It's not acceptable in one of the richest countries in the world.
Should we feel ashamed of the state of our mental health services?
Yes, we should, actually. We really should. They're just not good enough.
Back at Oxley's house, there is a constant stream of people needing urgent help.
As soon as one of these rooms becomes free, another patient is brought in within hours. Everyone that's being held here against their will is being detained under the Mental Health Act. But that law was created 40 years ago, and many say it's simply out of date.
Despite a major review and promise for reform, new legislation will not be passed before the next general election.
And Rebecca's with me now. Behind those locked doors, and despite the very best efforts of all the staff who we saw there, it is a pretty bleak picture, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. But the doctors on that ward told me that it's important that NHS mental health services are seen
and spoken about. Campaigners say there needs to be better funding, but also the Mental Health Act needs reforming, not only because of those shocking inequalities, black people and people living in poverty are far more likely to be detained, but also because patients don't get enough say in their treatment. The government told us they are committed to reform and that they're investing an extra £2.3 billion a year compared to 5 years ago. But the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, told me that if Labour win, they would put one of those hubs like we visited in every single community, because prevention would avoid the heavy cost, not only to individuals, but to the NHS. Now, a quick update on Tiwa, who bravely shared her story with us. She's now doing well and she's studying for a degree, and she chose to speak out in the hope of improving the system for the sake of others.
Unprecedented instance of the American government or any government openly signaling its desire to use the highly controversial technology offensively. So this is a whole procurement document, and there's more in here than just the fact that they want to do deepfakes. I have looked through this document, which, by the way, it doesn't have a closing date till December 31st, 2025. So they have opened this up as an announcement for technology development and advanced technology development that they want. And I just want to read a couple of things to you. At first, it talks about how they're now operating in a communication contested environment where information is weaponized. It's a world of convergence, the point where the gap between non-state and state actor capabilities diminishes. And they want things in here, I've just hit a few points. They want things in here like standoff biometrics, which include a distance of up to 8 feet, with the ability to quickly ingest physical, behavioral, physiological, and electromagnetic signatures, which can be used to measure response rates, provide confidence factors, and assist in determining campaign effectiveness. I mean, I get that it's a lot of word salad, but that's also horrifying. They want to be able to tell from 8 feet away if they scared the hell out of you with their propaganda campaign using your electromagnetic signatures. They also talk about touchless fingerprint capture at near and extended distances. They want to be able to capture people's fingerprints from a distance. Stuff I want to talk about is further down, way down, towards the bottom of the document, actually. They're talking about having payloads, the ability to send and receive messages in urban and rural environments, which include radio broadcast, television broadcast, cellular, including LTE and 5G, non-radio frequency communications, Internet of Things, loudspeakers, sonic projection, airdrop capabilities, electronic warfare, electronic attacks, long-term viability either with solar panels or energy sources, and holographic projection capability. Just sounds like Blue Beam to me. Then you go further and it talks about next generation effects of disruptive technology areas, which include non-traditional, non-kinetic effects. Technologies to effectively deny, degrade, disrupt, deceive, or destroy adversarial targets and infrastructure, which will be conducted at classified levels, secret and above. This document, by the way, is unclassified. And then it says directed energy and electromagnetic warfare, which is something interestingly that people have been saying on Twitter for like the last couple years, and they keep getting called conspiracy theorist over and over. But here it is right here. Directed energy and electromagnetic warfare, directed energy technologies for delivering non-kinetic, scalable effects on a multitude of hard and soft targets. Offensive electronic warfare payloads with overmatching target effectiveness at tactically and operationally relevant ranges. But then you get all the way down here to page 16, and this is where it covers military information support operations, which is what psychological operations changed into, so that it now sounds meaningless to most people and they don't realize that it's PSYOPs. MISO is PSYOPs, okay? MISO technologies for influence operations, digital deception, communication disruption, and disinformation campaigns at the tactical edge and operational levels. Provide next-generation capability to collect disparate data through public and open-source information streams such as social media, local media, and enable MISO to craft and direct influence operations and messages in relevant peer, near-peer environments. Provide a next generation of, quote, deep fake or other similar technology to generate messages and influence operations for non-traditional channels. Generate next-generation capability to take over Internet of Things devices for the collection of data and information from local populaces to enable breakdown of what messaging might be popular and accepted through sifting of data once received. So they want to be able to listen into people's Internet of Things connected devices to see if their deepfake and other psychological operations have properly influenced and deceived the people they were meant to influence and deceive. This would enable MISO to craft and promote messages that may be more readily received by local populace. So that's the level, okay, that we're at when our own government is openly calling for contractors to help them create these kinds of technologies specifically for use in psychological operations. And The Intercept says when it comes to disinformation, the Pentagon should not be fighting fire with fire. I mean, they always come out. This is the head of the Brookings Institution's.
Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about gang stalking, motivations, and the hierarchy that goes along with it. We're also going to talk about these operatives that participate in this community harassment. And we're going to finish up with some defense and countermeasures to deal with this community harassment program. But first, let's talk about that these perpetrators are trying to achieve in this post-2000 COINTELPRO program. Number one would be the victim's suicide. They simply want to drive the targeted individual insane to the point of his own suicide. Number two is they want to tamper with the target individual's psychological makeup, to tamper with his psyche. Number three, somehow frustrate and trick the victim into committing a crime. Now, there's a lot of trickery and deception involved here, and this can turn quite deadly. Myron May being a prime example of this. Number four, isolation to make the targeted individual not want to leave his home. This is key in making this program effective. Number five, destroy the victim's reputation and believability, as the victim will likely be viewed as mentally ill should they complain or report the abuse. Number six, force a victim to leave an area or to move. And number seven, to silence a victim. Now, this right here should give the targeted individual more incentive to get out here and publish and record these crimes taking place, knowing that one of their goals is to silence you, to take your rights away from you. Now, let's discuss some of the motivations of these perpetrators. Motivations for community harassment include, number one, revenge for real or imagined offense. Number two, false accusations of a crime the targeted individual may have committed. Now, this is used to destroy or discredit the victim's reputation. Perpetrators facilitate and fabricate lies about the targeted individual to make this a reality. And they use this tool to get others to go along with this sickness. Number three, silencing a whistleblower. Number four, defecting from a cult. Number five, a vital threat to a group or a organization. And number six, simply knowing too much. Now, let's discuss the hierarchy and the background of some of these operatives. What I have displayed here is the layout of the hierarchy and how the whole process operates from top to bottom. To those of you out there that are familiar with this hierarchy, you will realize that this is a simplified, concise version of the actual model. I made this model here for those of you out there that have not seen this before to give you an idea of how this whole process operates. The actual hierarchy has many more levels and is much more complex than this. So at the top of the hierarchy we have the communist bankers. They like to refer to themselves as the elite. Nothing could be a bigger joke than this. We as targeted individuals, we are actually the elite. But this is where the money comes from for this whole operation. This is how this whole thing is financially fueled from these guys right here. Next we have the one who governs the daily operations, and for this model here we'll call him the head controller. There's also a IT specialist involved. sometimes more than one, but one IT specialist could handle this whole operation. And in a lot of incidences, the head controller and the IT specialist are one and the same person. Now, this head controller, he can't handle this 24/7, 365-day-a-year harassment by himself. He's going to need some help, and that's where these around-the-clock watchers come in. And 4 people could handle this whole operation easily if you break it down into 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. I have an example of this right here. For instance, shift 1 could be Monday through Thursday, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Shift 2 could be 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. and so on. Now, these operatives here we're going to come back to in a minute and go into detail about them. Next, we have these handlers in the street. These are the perpetrators in the street that you are not meant to see. They're the ones that are overseeing the process of the community harassment as it takes place. They document and record your reaction and take these results back to their upper powers for analysis. Last, we have the street level perpetrators. Now, this is just your basic garbage. This is your community watch, citizens on patrol, local agencies, people that have been lied to, misled. These are the ones that are hands-on responsible for these crimes. Now, how is this process handled so efficiently and effectively, and how has the harassment been established where the targeted individual's surveillance is confined 24/7, 365 days a year? Who is responsible for the installation and the activation of these illegal devices? That's where these operatives come into play. These operatives are stealth agents of a different kind. Along with having the power to work alongside with the police department, these are the principal agents involved in the warrantless entries into your personal property. And that they work alongside with certain members of the police department leaves them with no fear or consequences for these crimes they commit. So who are the people committing these crimes? Well, one thing for sure makes sense. Inmates receiving early parole from prison in exchange to go to work for this new and improved COINTELPRO program makes a whole lot of sense. And these are the people that will do whatever it takes to stay out of prison. In essence, they become government property. And you got to understand it takes a certain mindset to be one of these operatives too. And 4 things come straight to mind when talking about these operatives and the way they think. Their mindset is blank, programmable, sick, and twisted. Now, since these are stealth agents that operate when the targeted individual's surveillance has been pinpointed away from his home or his car, it's very hard to catch one of these on video. So happens I happened to catch one when I was going into Walmart back in September of 2014. Basically what I did was I went inside, and I didn't stay inside maybe 15, 20 seconds, and I turned around and came back out. When I came back out, I was parked here, and within a 30-second interval, another car had pulled up beside of mine. It looked suspicious. So as I'm coming up to my car, the guy driving this car looks at me and moves on up here 2 spaces up, thinking I wouldn't think anything about it or noticing. Now, keep in mind back then I was only using one video camera, my dash cam, to get all my footage. So in this case it happened to work out. I was able to turn it at a 90-degree angle and catch the footage as I pulled slowly past this operative and around his car. Here's what he looks like. These operatives, amongst other things, are primarily responsible for the installation of the surveillance devices and tracking devices that have been illegally installed in your home, your vehicle, where you work, and places you may frequent. Logic dictates the FBI has increased its number of operatives and paid informants greatly in the last 10 years. However, the FBI no longer publishes this number. In the eyes of the FBI, COINTELPRO failed because it was extremely understaffed to handle up to 100,000 targets. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about this disposition matrix, but I would like to touch on a few key components of it. Those are neighborhood watch, law enforcement, and the end harassment. And let me explain something to those of you out there who are not targeted individuals or you're new to this post-2000 COINTELPRO. This is not some watch list where you're checked up on periodically, like maybe once a day like someone recently released on parole, or maybe you pass a few police cars daily. No, this is 24/7, 365 days a year, endless harassment. Targeted individuals' homes and cars are illegally broken into. Victims' personal property are subjected to warrantless searches. Now, when you're placed on a target list, you're then passed down to law enforcement. And this is when your physical surveillance can start. This is when all your rights have been destroyed. And these paid informants and these volunteer informants come into play. Ted Gunderson, a 30-year veteran of the FBI, handpicked by J. Edgar Hoover himself, had 700 people working for him. Ted Gunderson, in 2011, signed an affidavit stating that COINTELPRO never ended. Now, these operatives do the major dirty work, but let me tell you something about this neighborhood watch and these citizens on patrol. These citizens on patrol are the ones that work for these petty gift cards and other minor allowances, and to make things worse, they have no prior training. Wives and family members of the police department are some of the main participants in this community harassment program. Fortunately for us, the mental incapacity and the mental instability of these street-level perpetrators play in our favor. Let's take a look at this next video clip. These street-level perpetrators definitely suffer from a misfit disorder. These two rookies are attempting to drive a horse trailer. Now, obviously from the footage I'm getting ready to show you, you will see that they have never driven one before. After they have made their presence known, they decide to pull into a gas station. As you can see, as they pulled into the gas station, they hit a telephone pole.
He's hit a telephone pole. He just hit that telephone pole. What? He just hit that telephone pole.
It's probably a minor miracle they didn't destroy all those gas pumps. These perpetrators will do anything they are told, no matter if they have the cognitive ability to do so or not. So as we look at this disposition matrix or this kill list, we can see that the end result is death, whether by active shooter, suicide, or suicide by cop. Now, after careful study and analysis of this program, one can determine that this program is designed to turn one into a killing machine or to leave one just totally mentally desolate. Adolf Hitler used gang stalking back in Nazi Germany to deal with his threats and his enemies. He used gang stalking to make his threats to appear mentally unstable or mentally desolate. Therefore, that was his reasoning for having them placed into concentration camps. Now, let's fast forward to today. Are we perhaps seeing a weapon that is being used in today's society to make one appear to be mentally obsolete, therefore sending them to their final destination, to a FEMA camp? Think about that for a minute. As targeted individuals, the more you resist, the harder you make it on these perpetrators. And they will resort to anything to impose their intimidation tactics or their police tactics upon you. Let's look at an example of this in this next video clip.
Here we have another Florida tag specialist. When this perpetrator made his presence known, I speeded up to see his reaction. Now, these perpetrators love to use fear tactics. When their tactics are failing, they will resort to anything to instill fear, to intimidate you. He obviously didn't like the fact he was being ignored, as you will see here in 30 seconds. I decided to slow down and let him pass by. Now, as a surprise move, he starts flashing his firearm for higher level intimidation tactics. And of course, he starts hitting his brakes again to show his firearm again. These fear and intimidation tactics are otherwise known as police tactics.
Let's look at some countermeasures to defense against this police gang stalking and this community harassment. Number one, don't sweat the small stuff. Gaslighting is huge with these nut jobs as they try to use these warrantless entries to intimidate you. If these operatives are going to feloniously break and enter into your home just to move, for example, one lamp to the other side of the room just to mess with your psyche, who is the real mental case here? Number two, remember who is in control. If you move, they have to move. Hence, you control them, plain and simple. Number three, avoid isolation. Now, this is extremely important. When you isolate yourself, you give them control, and this is when they get their sickest kicks. Avoid sitting at home at all costs. This also makes them work harder when you're out and about. Number four, be unpredictable. This makes them work harder as well. And like I said, you want to make them work as hard as possible. Don't make anything easy for these perpetrators. Number five, join forces with other legitimate victims. There are a lot of fakes out there, so you have to be careful in this process. But if you're persistent, you will find legitimate targeted individuals to network with. And number six, film, film, film. I can't emphasize this enough. Go ahead and start today getting your evidence together. Let me give you an example with this next perpetrator.
As you can see, the perpetrator has made his move. He's made his presence known. What you need to do is get yourself in position to get a good camera shot of the perpetrator. When you are getting ready to make your shot, make sure your cameras are in position and they are focused. Since we were on the subject of hierarchy earlier, let's not forget one of the primary agendas this program is designed for. This program has been ingeniously designed to turn citizen against citizen, and with little energy expenditure, minimum manpower loss, this program delivers severe, widespread damage to the target. After years of research and destroying countless lives, this program and those who control it have become experts at playing groups against each other. Divide and conquer is the goal.
One thing these perpetrators hate more than anything is exposure. And another thing these mental stooges don't realize is these communist bankers, they get just as big a thrill at watching them squirm. 3 things you need to remember: persistence, sound discipline, and attitude. You need to wake up with the attitude every day that you're going to do what you want to do and live your life, and there's nothing these perpetrators can do to stop you. Positive attitude is key. And another thing you need to remember is you control your actions and reactions, not these mental misfits out in the street. And one more thing. I wonder how long one of these perpetrators would last on this program. Not very long, I think. You can contact me with comments. My email is attached.
Bit early today, no? Bit early today?
Yeah.
Why's that? Why's that? Bit early today, no? Why's that then?
I didn't get you.
What?
I didn't get you.
I said you're early today. Why's that?
We got late today, yeah.
Yeah, why? Why's that?
Why?
It's a question, isn't it? Huh? You can answer questions too, no? How come you're so early today?
You said that we came early today. Yeah, see, we start questions, please, early. That's why.
Yeah.
So I've answered the question.
You want us to start late before?
What time do you usually start?
We can start any time depending on
the way we do it.
Yeah, we have many sites to do, so it depends on whether we choose to start here first or we choose to start here last. The ball is entirely in our court. So, the most important is that
If we start with a person, an imaginary person, a fantasy person as it were, even a fantasy child, who has a whole self on the inside that is connected with their consciousness. They have a natural, spontaneous ability to fight for themselves, to know who they are, to know what they like, to know what they don't like, to know how they're feeling, to know when they're being violated, to know when they're happy, sad, to have interests, to have talent, to have natural, spontaneous creativity, natural, spontaneous expressions of their self. And then this child, this imaginary person, this person who, to some degree, is everybody that I've ever seen in the world, experiences violations, experiences sometimes crushing violations. Violations of the body, violations of the emotions, violations fundamentally of that sense of self. Their self is penetrated, attacked.
You couldn't make this up, could you? I mean, you really couldn't make this up. Calocane was a clear and present danger. He was hearing voices all the time. He was breaking into flats because he thought the voices were coming from the flat. At one stage, he thought his mother was being raped in a flat and he broke in. He was terrifying his neighbours. He was terrifying strangers. He was sectioned, allowed out, sectioned, allowed out, sectioned, allowed out. And then he went on to kill. I mean, it's indescribably incompetent.
And the family have said of the victims, the people in charge have got blood on their hands. He should have been in custody, or
he should have been in a secure psychiatric unit.
He should, because he was sectioned 4 times. There was a pattern of violent behaviour which was getting worse. He wasn't taking his medication, and that was happening repeatedly. And so he needed to be in a secure institution where he could have had his treatment injected into him.
And he was lying to his doctors. He was saying when he was banged up, basically, because he didn't like that.
But that's almost understandable. It's something that happens time and time again. I think one of the things that was highlighted, and Caroline, I don't know how you feel about this, it's something that carers and family members of someone with a mental illness have long complained about. Calocane said he didn't want the rest of his family to know anything about his diagnosis. As things stand, that's their right. But the family didn't hear the word schizophrenia even mentioned until after these dreadful, dreadful killings.
Yeah, and it's completely understandable that both, the families of the victims, are feeling distraught, and, were obviously distraught before, but this just piles it on for them because of what they can see as the missed opportunities. For someone like this, of course, there's a whole number of people that might be involved, but some of the people who should be involved, Tricia, as you say, is listening to those who are closest to him, who see him in different environments to that which psychiatrists and the police see, and they are listened to. And I think that's such an important part of how we work with these individuals with extreme mental health conditions, because it's that piecing together of the fuller picture that can enable the services to do the best they can. But there's no easy answer for these individuals. No, this is a service area, to be honest, that doesn't get a huge amount of talking about. Quite rightly, we hear a lot about issues around anxiety, depression, and that's really important that that's being discussed more openly. But we don't really spend enough time talking about this particular group of patients and their needs, Karen, and how to deal with them.
But in this particular case, unusually, a doctor warned in one of the reports, Calocane could kill. Yeah. And that's unusual.
Sharon, it is really unusual for somebody, a doctor, actually to write that down in a report. I was really shocked to hear that. Were you?
A couple of things struck me. First of all, I thought that doctor was very perceptive in predicting the future, because I would argue that up until that point, his risk profile was worrying, but it wasn't very concerning. So another way of putting that is that I've worked in criminal courts as a psychiatrist, and I don't want to alarm your viewers, but I would see dozens of patients every week that would have that low-level offending, low-level violence, and the vast, vast majority won't go on to do something as heinous as murder. So that's the first thing. And the second thing that I thought is the same as I think everybody else is thinking is, if that doctor genuinely thought that, why did they not act on it? Why was he discharged within a couple of weeks?
How difficult is it to assess someone like him when actually they're clever and they're quite good at lying? As I was going to say earlier, he didn't like being locked up, obviously, so he lied to his doctors, and he said that he wasn't hearing the voices anymore. He was. We know that because he told someone else when they let him out. But he lied, and lied convincingly, so they thought he was getting better.
So I think there's a couple of hurdles here. First of all, as you say, whether a patient is actually engaging, whether they've got insight, whether they're letting the medical staff know about their innermost delusions and intentions. So that's really difficult to do if somebody's not playing ball. So that's one issue. But another issue is that you can get somebody well at the point of discharge. And that's not the problem. The problem is when they're in the community weeks, months later, when they start taking their medication. Follow-up. So they could be relatively safe at the point of discharge, but later on they become dangerous.
Sharon, I know they're going to be looking, the Labour government is going to be revisiting, hopefully, the Mental Health Act, which needs an absolute overhaul. But at the moment, the way the mental health services are, they're on their knees. You have to become more and more and more ill. We've had several incidents, many, many thousands. Of course, we've got the Lampard inquiry coming up, looking into 2,000 deaths, from 2000 to 2023. But people go in and say, listen, when they do say, I am hearing voices, I am ill, you're not ill enough. Come back when you're absolutely... too far gone, and then you get these situations where people are acting out or taking it a step further purely to get a bed within a mental health facility.
And the number of beds have gone down, Trish. Yeah. Inpatient beds have gone down. And on the one hand, understandably, there's been big debates about, actually, why are people in some of these inpatient units, not necessarily with the conditions that this man has, but why are they there? There should be more community, and there's an argument for that. But the truth is, none of this is cheap.
No.
And it can't be fragmented. When someone comes out of an inpatient unit and goes into... we were talking earlier, there is a framework for actually community treatment. There are orders that can be used to ensure that the person does turn up and has to turn up and have conversations with their mental health support worker. But actually, it's still fragmented and it's under-resourced.
Yeah.
It's
Could
under-resourced.
we ask you this question? I mean, you work with these people, as you say, and you've seen some very alarming cases presented to you that you've had to treat. What's the takeaway from this report for you as a professional? What would you have done differently?
So I think the problem isn't that we don't have the safeguards. The safeguards exist. So Caroline mentioned there's community treatment orders, which is like a contract with the patient to take their medication. We have assertive outreach teams that will literally go to the patient's house and supervise them on a regular basis. So the problem isn't the systems don't exist. The problem is there's not enough resources. Yeah. So all of these teams are so overwhelmed and overburdened that they've got this pressure to try and discharge people as soon as possible because the waiting list is...
So does that mean that someone like you, I'm not saying you personally, but someone like you doing the job you're doing, is knowingly, because of that pressure, discharging the patient like Calocane, knowing that actually they're not
you don't. But here's the thing: you don't know. I mean, I'm biased because my late sister had paranoid schizophrenia, and we do have to say that you're more likely to kill yourself, sadly, and that's a failing of the system. But the fact is, and Caroline, you absolutely said it, the resources in the mental health system have been chipped away and chipped away. CAMS for teenagers, getting in early intervention. You try and find a mental health intervention for a young person before they become, taken over by the system. Hen's teeth, isn't it?
And for these particular individuals, obviously the Labour government said they want to put more people into schools to support young people, and that's really important. But for these particular individuals, there is quite a complicated set of treatments and support that is required. That has to be personalised to those individuals, may involve years of inpatient, outpatient, community-based treatments as well. And it's going to need a lot more thinking about getting that right. I think we have the staff who are really committed in this area. Yeah. I think we have the framework. It's about the resources and reducing the piecemeal way in which some of the different services like the police operate as well with our mental health
But this has been a
workers.
Cinderella part of the NHS for years.
Oh, yeah.
Because
Totally.
I was remembering... Do you remember when Jonathan Zito was stabbed to death on a London Underground station by a paranoid schizophrenic who'd been in and out of the system over 5 years? That was 30 years ago. Stabbed to death, failed by the system, and I don't think much has changed.
Well, and the truth is that, in the last 18 months, with everything that's been happening, again, as in previous decades, it's the acute sector, the A&E, the waits there. The push is then to prioritise getting people through the A&E. And at some point, you've got to think about, well, where does that leave these services? And often it's not in the place they need to be in terms of the importance they have to our health and well-being.
Can I just ask you a sort of clinical question? When you're treating somebody who hears voices, which they are convinced are real. They know they're in their head, but they think they're coming from real entities, real people. Is there any point in their treatment when you're able to persuade them through medication or through some kind of counselling that actually they're not real? Or do they constantly think that they're real?
So my answer to that, Richard, would be it very much depends on the patient. So firstly, you can't detain somebody unless under the Mental Health Act unless there's a degree of risk. So an individual can be hearing voices, but if they're not command hallucinations telling them to hurt themselves or other people, then you can't force them.
Sometimes the voices are nice and encouraging. They're not always bad.
Yeah.
And then part of the treatment, as well as the medication, as well as the antipsychotics, is psychotherapy. So the psychologist on the team will speak to the individual, and some individuals, once they've taken the medications and the voices go, they get insight. Other individuals, through talking through logically whether the voices exist or not, they eventually gain insight gradually. And unfortunately, there's some individuals who never gain insight. So it's a constant battle of relapsing and remitting medication, getting off medication.
Just on a human level, what would have been the reaction the morning after these terrible killings amongst the people who'd been treating him and who discharged him? How would they have felt?
I think they'd be absolutely shocked. They'd be questioning themselves. Did they make the wrong call? I alluded to this before, but I do think Calocane's risk profile wasn't actually that alarming before he did what he did. But I still think they'll be questioning themselves, absolutely.
Except that doctor did argue that he was a potential killer. So wasn't his risk profile more severe than perhaps normal? Because that is an unusual thing, isn't it, for a doctor to say?
It's a very unusual thing to say, but I don't know how the doctor knew that, because, as I say, there's so many other people. There's
but he was right.
Thousands of
he did know.
But he did, yeah.
He was right.
It is a very, very complicated issue. But, as you say, it's got to be about resources and joined-up services, including the police.
Well, look, the National Director for Mental Health at NHS England, Claire Murdoch, has said this. CQC have identified unacceptable failings in the care and treatment provided to Valdo Calocane. Nationally, the NHS has already started work to enact all of CQC's recommendations, with every provider of mental health services reviewing the care that people with serious mental illnesses are getting. It goes on to say that they've also provided further guidance which instructs providers not to discharge people if they don't attend appointments, and reiterates the importance of sharing risk assessments with the partners and the patients' families, which, of course, did not happen in this particular case.
And if you've been affected by any of the issues that we've been discussing, you can find advice and support at itv.com/helplines.
OK, and of course the victims are, today as we speak, the people suffering because their families were the victims. And we're going to be speaking to Emma Webber, the mother of one of them, just after 8 o'clock. A very bleak morning for all of those families, having seen that panorama report last night and, of course, having seen the results of that report this morning. OK, we'll come back to that. Thank you very much indeed for your time this morning. That was really interesting. Now,
a man has appeared in court charged with the murder of the schoolboy Daniel Anjorin in northeast London. Daniel, who was 14, was on his way to school when he was fatally stabbed in Hainault on Tuesday. Marcus Monzo, who's 36, also faces several other charges, including 2 counts of attempted murder. Here's Lucy Manning.
Marcus Monzo arrived at court in central London with heavy security. The dual Brazilian-Spanish 36-year-old is accused of murdering 14-year-old Daniel Anjorin on Tuesday in Hainault. The court heard more details about what the prosecutor described as horrific offences. At 6:45, a van was driven at speed, knocking over one of the victims. Mr. Monzo is then said to have slashed him with a samurai sword in the neck. 15 minutes later in Lang Close, it's alleged he forced his way into a house where a 4-year-old and her parents were sleeping, attacking a man in the bedroom, saying he would cause him harm if you don't believe in God. It's alleged that then in the street he ran up behind Daniel Anjorin as he walked to school, slashing him in the neck and stabbing him, and then hid in the bushes and attacked a male and female police officer. Today, the sister of the man attacked in his home said he was a hero for protecting his wife and child, but faced a really long and traumatising recovery. In court, Marcus Monzo, wearing a grey tracksuit, was flanked by security officers and held his left hand up against his chest throughout the 7-minute hearing. Marcus Monzo stood and spoke slowly in court as he gave his name. He's charged with 7 offences: murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, 2 offences of grievous bodily harm and possession of a samurai sword. On Tuesday, hours after the attack, the police started searching the suspect's house in Newham in East London.
He was like really minding his own business, no space for interaction. He's always by himself, no girlfriend, no parties, no anyone, just him.
Daniel's family described the 14-year-old as a wonderful child, well-loved and hard-working, and that his death left a gaping wound in the family. A loss felt across the community. The teenager just steps from his home.
Into the death of a 23-year-old victim of a Birmingham killing spree has found Jacob Billington was unlawfully killed. He was one of 8 victims of knife man Zephaniah McLeod, who was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 21 years in 2021. Today, a coroner said there were key communication issues. Our reporter Sangeeta Lal has been at the coroner's court in Birmingham for us this morning. Sangeeta, how did today's inquest conclude?
What today's inquest found, there were multiple failures in Zephaniah McLeod's mental health treatment during his time in prison before he killed Jacob Billington in September 2020, and there was no adequate plan in place for his release. Now, McLeod stabbed 23-year-old Jacob Billington in the neck while he was on a night out in Birmingham with his friends. And this all happened just 5 months after Zephaniah McLeod had been released from prison, but crucially after it was known that he was a high risk to the public and that his mental health had been deteriorating. Now, McLeod, who was 27 years old at the time of the attacks, was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic who had told probation officers and his mental health team that he heard voices in his head telling him to stab and kill people. Now, while serving time for other offences, it was known he was violent, had stopped engaging with mental health services and had stopped taking medication. And today's inquest found key issues with communication between his team at HMP Park, Birmingham and Solihull NHS Trust, and another agency designed to protect the public called MAPA. Essentially what the inquest found is they were all working separately and weren't communicating with each other. At one point, no one within these agencies knew where McLeod was. And what the coroner today said was that there was no provision available or guidance when a high-risk prisoner is released, and has prepared a prevention of future deaths report that these agencies will now have to respond to.